What would you do if you realized that your Formula One car reacts differently in each curve, as if it became each lap? That is exactly what Lewis Hamilton is living in Ferrari. But what they discovered in Hungary could change everything. Lewis Hamilton arrived at the Hungary Grand Prix with a mixture of renewed determination and a silent emotional burden. It was his first season with Ferrari, a change that promised to revitalize his career, a stage with epic dies. The 7 times world champion piloting for the most legendary team in the history of Formula One. It was not just a sports decision, it was a personal, almost romantic bet. An attempt to close his legacy with a last glorious chapter. And if there was a scenario where it seemed to have everything in favor, that was Hungaroring. Hamilton not only dominates statistically in Hungary, emotionally too. It is the circuit where he has achieved more victories than in any other, a total of 8. And where he has offered some of the most masterful actions of his career. From traced impossible to memorable classifications, the Hungarian layout was a territory where its connection with the car used to touch the supernatural. But what lived in 2025 was exactly the opposite. A total disconnection, almost cruel. Throughout the classification day, the camera focused on a visibly uncomfortable Hamilton, fighting the car, constantly speaking on radio, looking for answers that never arrived. In the garage, their engineers analyzed each data without understanding how Leclerc could be so far from the rhythm. Because while Hamilton was not adherence, balance, or trust, his partner flew on the same path with a fluency that brushed the perfect. The contrast was not only uncomfortable, it was humiliating. And it was precisely that abyss of performance between the two Ferrari that triggered Hamilton's emotional collapse. When the Q2 flag fell, the times were unappealable. Hamilton was for just 15 thousandths, Leclerc in the pole. A ridiculous margin in terms of timing, but gigantic in terms of meaning. Because those 15 thousandths not only left him out of Q3, he was pushed to his worst classification in Hungary in more than a decade. And even more serious, they led him to say in public something that no Ferrari pilot had said before that direct way. Facing the press, without filters or diplomacy, Hamilton sentenced, "Maybe Ferrari needs to change pilot. Today I was absolutely useless." That phrase fell like a bomb. It was not a rhetorical exaggeration. It was a diagnosis, an act of despair. A confession that not only left journalists ice cream, but forced Ferrari to an emergency meeting to understand what was happening inside the team. Because it was not simply a bad day on the track. It was a world champion publicly admitting that he felt an obstacle to the team. It was, in essence, the absolute loss of confidence in his ability to compete at the highest level with that car at that time. The most painful thing for Ferrari was not just the fall of its star. It was the fact that it happened in Hungary, Hamilton's personal temple, where every year he seemed to challenge even logic. That was there where his link with the SF25 collapsed completely converted the episode into a sports tragedy. The team went from celebrating Leclerc pole to try to contain an internal crisis. What should be a day of glory became a reflection of a deep fracture between pilot and car. A fracture that, instead of closing over time, began to reveal an even more alarming crack. The possibility that Ferrari was developing a car that only works for one of its pilots. And Hamilton, for the first time, wondered aloud if he had somewhere in that future. After Hamilton's harsh personal defeat in Hungary's classification, the team's attention focused on understanding what was happening under the skin of SF25. In Ferrari, they knew that they could not afford to look the other way. It was not a marginal difference in performance or an isolated error in the tuning. What had happened was deeper, more disturbing, and with potential to detonate a structural crisis. Thus began one of the most detailed technical analysis in the recent history of the team. The engineers extracted the telemetry data with a clear intention. Compare each Hamilton movement with those of Leclerc, under the same conditions in the same compounds in similar turns. And what they found was more than worrying. The records revealed a flagrant disconnection between the inputs of Hamilton and the autoplaza responses. The car seemed to operate with unpredictable internal logic. In some curves, he reacted aggressively to the slightest flyer turn. In others, it took second vital fractions to obey. It was not simply a difference of trust. It was an incoherent technical pattern. As the asphalt temperatures rose during the sessions, that disconnection intensified. The loads that passed through the rear suspension varied anomalously. The distribution of electronic braking did not respond with the same precision return after. And traction control, far from stabilizing behavior, introduced even more noise in the interaction between tires and motor. The most alarming was discovering that this variability did not follow a simple logic based on degradation, temperature, or aerodynamic load. It was a controlled chaos for Leclerc, but uncontrolled for Hamilton. In other words, the same car behaved like two completely different machines depending on who was behind the wheel. Ferrari found a crucial track in the way Hamilton applied the motor brake on the low-speed curves. Under normal conditions, that style should help stabilize the rear axle. But with the new active suspension installed from the Belgium Grand Prix, that pattern generated counterproductive responses. Overload in the hydraulic system, loss of traction, and automatic micro-adjusts that only worsened the situation. The conclusion was painful but unavoidable. The car was designed or had been developing in the direction of Leclerc's needs. And this opened a new dimension of the problem. It was not a secret that Leclerc had been with Ferrari for years, building a technical relationship with engineers, actively participating in the development of the car. His style, aggressive in the entrance and surgical in correction, had molded many of the aerodynamic and mechanical decisions of the car from the era of SF23. But what was a competitive advantage at the time was now leaving one of the best pilots in modern history out of the game. Hamilton was not simply uncomfortable. He was driving a machine that did not understand his language. That revelation shook Ferrari's technical dome, because they could no longer blame the low performance to adaptation, style, or even the pilot's motivation. They were facing a deep dilemma. How could they build a competitive car for both pilots when their styles demanded completely different answers from the same chassis? And the most worrying thing was what they did not know. If this divergence could be corrected in the middle of the season, or if they were destined to live with two parallel realities within the same team, with a car that was only truly competitive for one of them. Ferrari had created a powerful tool, yes, but with such a specific tuning that for Hamilton it was like piloting a challenged instrument. And in the symphony of Formula One, that makes the difference between leading an orchestra and getting lost in the noise. As the analyses became deeper and the most clear responses, an awkward suspicion began to float between Maranello corridors. What if the problem was not just a technician? What if what was happening with Hamilton was not simply a matter of incompatibility with the SF25, but the result of strategic decisions that, consciously or not, were favoring Charles Leclerc? Ferrari had introduced a new rear suspension in the Belgium GP. Since then, the car had shown significant improvements in tensile and curve output, greater control over gear height changes, and remarkable stability in technical circuits. But when he studied carefully how and why that improvement felt so well in the hands of Leclerc, the key arose. The system was specifically calibrated to get the most out of a precise, aggressive driving style, based on late braking and reactive direction. Exactly the Leclerc profile. Instead, Hamilton, famous for his soft, progressive driving, focused on tire conservation and the general equilibrium of the car, found that the same suspension became his worst enemy. The control of the dynamic height, which for Leclerc offered a stable platform to attack the curves, for Hamilton translated into unexpected oscillations in the balance, load changes in the middle of the curve, and unpredictable reactions of the rear train. In essence, I was fighting a tool designed for another pilot. Was this a deliberate preference? Or simply a natural consequence of time and familiarity that Leclerc has with the Ferrari environment? Whatever the answer, the result was the same. A technical imbalance that was transforming the relationship between both pilots and the team into a minefield. And for a pilot like Hamilton, whose driving is based on that precise connection, that inability to understand and anticipate the car is not a simple disadvantage. It is a competitive conviction. After everything that happened in the Hungary Grand Prix, which initially seemed a simple bad weekend, has become a storm that puts Ferrari's stability at several levels. Because we are no longer talking about a specific performance difference between two pilots. Nor is it only a badly calibrated piece or an unfavorable configuration. The fracture exposed in Hungary forces Ferrari to answer a question as complex as it is urgent. Who is developing this car and who is being built for? Ferrari needs to make a deep strategic decision. It is not about modifying the rear wing or adjusting the rear suspension to content Hamilton. It is about redefining its technical approach so that the SF25 is not a binary car that works only for a specific driving style. It is not sustainable to depend exclusively on the performance of Leclerc, however bright its talent. Not when you have in the other seat a legend of motor racing that still is hungry for victories and whose potential is being stifled by decisions that, although involuntary, are being deeply exclusive. Hungary 2025 will be remembered not only as the circuit where Leclerc achieved a brilliant pole, but as the day Hamilton sounded all alarms. With a devastating phrase, he revealed a structural imbalance that threatens to undermine Ferrari's most ambitious sports project in the last decade. A project that, until that moment, promised gloria, but is now in a dangerous tightrope.